Hello, Juma.
Marwan, I
Yeah,
am well.
nice.
How are you and how is the family?
Yeah, we are very well, thank you. It's nice to see you in your African attire. You're looking great, mate.
Well, if it was summer, we would have been able to do this outdoors. Being winter, you could only wear this African clothing indoors until we get a little more warm weather here in London.
Tell us a bit about yourself, Danjuma. Who is Danjuma Bihari?
Uh, right. As I often tell people, there's a short and long answer. The short answer, if you go to a supermarket to buy an item, often you look at the back of the package, it's written at the bottom, produce of more than one country. And that is the short answer because I am comprised of disparate threads. And the short answer is that I was born in London to a Trinidadian father, and I was brought up from the age of 4 in Trinidad until the age of 23. I did primary school in Trinidad, secondary school, and even university there. I even was married in Trinidad. So culturally, the short answer to your question, culturally, you are shaped by your experiences where you were brought up, the first fast friends you've made, and they continue to be among my closest friends, which I think makes me Trinidadian. And that would be the short answer. Yeah.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you very much. It's fascinating. Let's start by defining the subject that we are discussing today. What is Pan-Africanism?
That is as broad a question as it is long. The idea of it has so many presupposing questions behind it. But the short answer, I would say, again, there's always a long and a short answer. I would say the short answer is a concern for the upliftment and development of peoples of African origin who have shared many experiences in common, many of them traumatic. So I think what the Pan-Africanists tend to agree upon are the things that have not the bad experiences that we have endured that have shaped our response to the rest of the world. And having looked at the African continent and the peoples outside the African continent, there is much that is similar in the experiences, whether it's the experience of colonialism on the African continent or the experience of transatlantic slavery and displacement in the diaspora. There are experiences that are so similar in our relationship to other people, especially those former colonial powers, that has inspired us to consider ourselves one people on many, not on every level, but on more levels. We hold with a view that our similarities in these areas are such that we must unite. And how that unity plays out is what I hope that we can develop as our discussion goes on. I leave it to your good offices to direct the trajectory of the discussion here from. Yes.
Well, thank you very much, Juma. Who started the Pan-African movement and where did it start? Where did it happen and when?
I believe the Pan-African movement is a movement of many. You know how we have a joke that you tell a joke in Dinka in Geng, and then someone comes and tells the same joke in Swahili. And it's, but that's a Jeng joke. I said, no, it's a Swahili joke. No, it's a Hausa joke. And then you realize these people have had different experiences that have given rise to the same ideas. So it's hard to point out the actual provenance as to what particular country started it. But what I would say is the nature of the diaspora gives us a clue, an indication that the idea of Pan-Africanism actually started outside the continent. That is not to say, and I hasten to add this, that there were not concepts of Pan-Africanism developing within the continent. And as later in our discussion, we will talk about the intra-African, not inter, the intra-African diaspora, which of course itself brings up notions of Pan-Africanism. But for now, what I would say is, going back to your question, at the very beginning, I think it required the journey away from the immensity of the African continent for people who had been removed, not only physically, by transatlantic slavery, Indian Ocean slavery, trans-Saharan slavery, Red Sea slavery. It required people at a certain remove, because you're talking about a continent of 12 million square miles. I'm speaking in old money now. That is so vast that you had to be at a certain distance from the continent to see the African continent in all its immensity, in all its complexity, and all its grandeur. To see Africa, you had to be away from it. So there is an argument that the Pan-African movement actually started outside the continent, the descendants of those who were enslaved, who had experienced that deracination, the rootlessness, the uprooting, culturally and otherwise, and the ongoing discrimination at the end of the following emancipation, that ongoing, whether in America you could call it during the Reconstruction period, or in the Caribbean, you look at it as that period in time after 1838 in the British Caribbean, when chattel slavery ended. Of course, we know that this transatlantic slave trade was ended by the Britisher in 1807. But it took another about 25 more years or so before, or 30 years before emancipation came. But during that time, let's take one island like Trinidad, for example, as a case study. You would have had people who were descendants of not just slaves, but immigrant labor from Africa. And a lot of these people were therefore not always subject to the exigencies, the trauma of the slave experience, but they were already displaced Africans. You had, after 1807, like I said, at the end of after the abolition of the slave trade by the British now began to deploy squadrons across the Atlantic to intercept slave ships from nations that had still continued the slave trade. France, Americans, the Spanish in Cuba, Cuba was among, and the Portuguese. Brazil was among one of the last countries where slavery ended. So I think there's Cuba, Brazil, and Suriname are among the three countries where the slave trade and slavery continued right up to the 1880s. Whereas with the British islands, chattel slavery ended in 1838. So during that period, you had the British colonies had a sort of like a head start, if you will, on consciousness and developing notions of a shared experience that wherever there were still slaves, we are all still enslaved. If there are still slaves in Cuba, if there are still slaves in Brazil, if there are still slaves in Sudan, we are all still enslaved. And so a place like Trinidad, where I come from, does have the distinction of being one of the countries where some pioneers of and I don't want to garner all the glory. I'm constructing this, but I'm hoping not to sound as if we have some sort of Trinidadian exceptionalism. But we had leaders like Henry Sylvester Williams, George Padmore, the one you may have heard of because he was in London and still alive at the time when you and I came to London, C.L.R. James. He was living in Brixton at the time when you and I were living in South London, Norwood area. So people like these, and he lived into his 90s. But all these guys were among the pioneers of the Pan-Africanist movement. But prior to them, there was a person by the name of Edward Wilmot Blyden from the Virgin Islands. I think either the American or his name Blyden. It may be one of the Dutch Virgin Islands or the American Virgin Islands. Or there are three sets of Virgin Islands. I think there's the British Virgin. These are Caribbean islands. And he was a polymath and an intellectual. And he came around in time before the three people I mentioned, George Padmore, C.L.R. James, and Henry Sylvester Williams. And he was a Christian theologian by training. In those days, if the descendant of slavery was going to acquire an education, it usually came through the church, through the seminary or a Christian education. And he was deployed to Liberia, which, as you know, Liberia, like Sierra Leone, were almost the capitals, not the rest of the country. So Monrovia, the capital of Liberia, and Freetown, the capital of Sierra Leone, were manufactured. They were for repatriated slaves. Monrovia, the capital of Liberia, was created as a repatriated colony for slaves, American slaves who were freed to establish a homeland on the continent of Africa, in Liberia. So that James Monroe is a former, as you must have heard of the Monroe Doctrine, James Monroe is a former American president. So the capital of Liberia, Monrovia, is named for James Monroe. You must have heard of the Monroe Doctrine. But Freetown, of course, as its name suggests, was created by the British as a homeland for repatriated slaves and those whom they liberated after they intercepted those ships that had continued the slave trade after 1807, when the British had abolished it. So Edward Wilmot Blyden was a theologian who was sent to work in Monrovia in Liberia, and he wrote very interesting books, having traveled through the hinterland through Liberia into Guinea-Conakry, through Sierra Leone, and back around, so that whole forested region of West Africa, the far west part of West Africa. And he wrote books comparing the cultures of the people and actually saying, well, look, these places like Freetown and Monrovia, Freetown in Sierra Leone, Monrovia in Liberia, they should not just exist to serve the interests of the former colonial powers as a bridgehead now in the colonial period. No, they should serve as a place where Africans can regroup, regather, and strategize on how to form and fashion their own destiny. So Edward Wilmot Blyden is one name that actually comes before the three names from Trinidad that I mentioned: Henry Sylvester Williams, George Padmore, and C.L.R. James. I think perhaps I'm going into too much detail on this, and I'll stop. And if you want to ask a further question, I can always flesh out what we have started discussing on this in response to this question.
Of course, when we Africans think about Africans in the African continent, not necessarily the Africans of the diaspora, and when we talk about the African diaspora, of course, we mean all the way to the days of slavery until now. So when we think about the Africans still at home, when they think about Pan-Africanism, they think about Kwame Nkrumah. And now did Kwame interact with these people? Perhaps England and the West was the hub where these minds met?
Well, this is the paradox of the colonial experience, in that it is because Kwame Nkrumah was in England, en route, in London actually, en route to America, where he met C.L.R. James, who said to him, he wrote a letter to he met George Padmore, who wrote a letter to C.L.R. James, or vice versa. These two heavyweights were in contact with each other, C.L.R. James and George Padmore. One was in America, one was in London. And he wrote a letter saying, one wrote a letter to the other, because I'm mixing up who sent Nkrumah to whom. But one of them wrote a letter saying, I am sending a young man to you, teach him what you know of Pan-Africanism, because he's determined to kick the Europeans out of Africa. And it was either C.L.R. James sending Nkrumah to meet George Padmore, or George Padmore sending Nkrumah to meet C.L.R. James. It's one of but the thing about these two people, George Padmore had spent a lot of time in Russia, in the USSR, Russia, in Stalinist Russia. And there, as a former socialist, hardcore socialist, he became disenchanted with the turn that Stalinism had taken. And so he returned from Russia less enthusiastic about international working class socialism. And he felt, look, perhaps more of a focus should be directed. The most famous one was Marcus Mosiah Garvey from Jamaica. He was, in fact, the one who, but Marcus Garvey's star didn't begin to shine until long after his death. I believe he died in England in 1940. But Marcus Garvey was the one who started the UNIA, the United Negro Improvement Association. And he also started a shipping line called the Black Star Shipping Line. And that is why on the flag of independent Ghana, you have a black star. That's why. Because Marcus Garvey from Jamaica was the person who really took Pan-Africanism to the level of the working man. In my opinion, C.L.R. James, Henry Sylvester Williams was a lawyer. C.L.R. James was also an intellectual, and so was George Padmore. Their approach to Pan-Africanism was they were ideologues. But Marcus Garvey, I wouldn't say he didn't have as much education as they, but he had that interaction and that reach with the common man. So he worked in Costa Rica for a while. I think he also visited Jamaican expatriate communities that were building the Panama Canal in Panama. And everywhere, and then after that, he went to North America. And wherever he went, he noticed the situation that blacks were in. And because he was able to make that comparison between blacks in Latin America, blacks in America, North America, and in the Caribbean, Marcus Garvey was able to say, look, in terms of wherever we are as a people, we are always discriminated against and oppressed. And it is time for us to realize that the common factor in our oppression is our being black or coming from Africa. And just as Europe exists for the Europeans, Africa should exist for the Africans. Now, it is said that this phrase, the famous motto of Marcus Garvey, Africa for the Africans, those at home and those abroad. Marcus Garvey added the second part of that phrase. The first part of the phrase, Africa for Africans, apparently was coined by Edward Wilmot Blyden, of whom I just spoke, the one who had traveled from the Caribbean to Liberia, Guinea-Conakry, and through Sierra Leone. He's the one who said Africa for the Africans, to which Marcus Garvey added later on, because he came later in history, those at home and those abroad. So the idea of Pan-Africanism is both inside the continent and outside, because if you take a person like Edward Wilmot Blyden, he is both an African in the sense that he lived perhaps more of his life in Liberia and Sierra Leone and West Africa than he did in the Caribbean. And it is that back and forth connection that you have with Kwame Nkrumah. Kwame Nkrumah spent a lot of his time studying in America. He used to be a very common sight at the Africa Center in Covent Garden in London. You may remember the Ethiopian gentleman, our neighbor, Mr. Araya. Mr. Araya studied in London at that time, and he was fortunate that he met Nkrumah and others like him when he was studying in London at the Africa Center in Covent Garden. That's where they used to all congregate and discuss Pan-African politics. Mr. Araya from Ethiopia and Kwame Nkrumah. So he used to tell me a lot about those days when that's where the Africans in London, the students used to meet. And and of course you would get the Caribbeans and whatever African Americans who were politicized, living in this country at the time, they would all gravitate to a place like the Africa Center in Covent Garden. And there they would have these meetings discussing the future of the continent. I believe Jomo Kenyatta also may have been among the people that Mr. Araya told me that he met in the Africa Center at Covent Garden, Jomo Kenyatta, before, he studied, I think, anthropology in London. I'm not sure if he studied at the School of Oriental and African Studies, but Jomo Kenyatta did study anthropology. And I think perhaps, but they were all meeting each other. Kenyans perhaps meeting a Ghanaian for the first time, Ethiopians meeting Kenyans for the Zimbabweans meeting, and so on. And there is that sort of now in the French colonies, things like that were also happening. The people like Blaise Diagne from Senegal, these countries, the French parts of Africa were considered like Département de France. They were like France outre-mer, France, but France abroad. So you'd find that many of them would meet in Paris and they would have the same sort of discussions that are going on in England, or whether if they met in America, the same sort of discussions would be happening. So Pan-Africanism, in a sense, what we're speaking about is Pan-Africanism as it developed in Anglophone Africa, really. But it was also happening with people like Cheikh Anta Diop from Senegal when he was studying at the Sorbonne, and Frantz Fanon from Martinique in the Caribbean, which is still a Département de France. It's still considered like a French colony. And they would be meeting in Paris and having similar discussions. So the idea of Africans at home and Africans abroad, or the diaspora, was a thing that was happening as far back as in the French colonies, and perhaps in the Dutch part of the world as well. I only know Africans of Dutch origin in Suriname, but there are other islands such as Curaçao and Aruba, Saba, and I think Saint Martin in the Caribbean, which have Africans descendants through Dutch enslavement. And perhaps in Holland, they had, because Holland has Leiden University, which is like the equivalent of SOAS, School of Oriental and African Studies in London. And they focused a lot on ethnic anthropology. And people would meet in those places, like how you and I would have met at SOAS Coffee Bar to have these sort of discussions. The students who were black, whether they were from, let's say, Suriname or another Dutch-speaking colony, would be experiencing the same racism, the same marginalization, the same, sometimes violence in the streets of Paris or the streets of London. It would be happening in London, Amsterdam, in Paris, so that those early black people who have an intellectual stamp will realize, well, we are actually the same people. On the ground level, perhaps, people don't, the ordinary day-to-day uneducated level, no. But at the beginning, Pan-Africanism was an intellectual movement. With Marcus Garvey, it became a movement of fundraising, so you had to move among people. So in America, Marcus Garvey was well known for fundraising to build the Black Star shipping line venture and other projects that he had going. And therefore, what happens is now you find Pan-Africanism coming down to a more grassroots. It's less a movement of ideologues. Just like with the Zionist movement in the beginning, people like Theodor Herzl, he was an ideologue, an intellectual. Chaim Weizmann of the Russian Jewish, who became the first president of Israel. Also, they were ideologues and intellectuals, but later on the movement began to gather mass appeal, and it's the same. And there are weird similarities in that the Bible for a lot of early Pan-Africanists was remember the first education that the slaves, ex-slaves would come from the seminary or Christian schools, whether it's the Church of England or the Catholic Church. And so a lot of the interpretation of their predicament would mirror the captivity in Egypt under the Pharaoh, or the captivity in Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar. Yeah, the Israelite captivity, the Exodus, the idea of the Exodus would provide a sort of stimulus for forming notions of
and hence Bob Marley's lyrics.
Yes.
It will expand a lot because there are more questions coming. What I wanted you to say before we move on a little bit really is, since Nkrumah and you personally have traveled in Africa as well. You have traveled widely, really, which is.
I knew Nkrumah's children personally.
You've seen East Africa. You've seen parts of North. You've seen North Africa. You've seen Egypt and Sudan, but you've seen Africa proper. You've gone to Kenya, Tanzania, and also you've seen West Africa.
Very much detail. Yes.
Who has tried to step into the shoes of Kwame Nkrumah in the modern era, and what have they done, and how far did they go?
Well, I think Nkrumah was a pioneer, a trailblazer in that regard. Other people like Thomas Sankara, who did have those kind of ideas, they never got beyond a certain level of, they weren't allowed in the French colonies or the French former colonies. They were given very short shrift. They were watched very closely. They were supervised very closely in the French colonies, more perhaps than in the British colonies. You had leaders like in Amilcar Cabral in Guinea-Bissau, but they were very much, what mattered to them most was freeing their own countries. And that consumed so much of their time that they had very little time left over for anything else. So I don't know if I've never heard Robert Mugabe, who in a sense could be considered a protege or a disciple of Nkrumah. I've never heard of Mugabe speaking about Pan-Africanism to that extent, although at the height of the Ethiopian famine in 1985-86, between 84 to 86, the height of the Ethiopian famine, Zimbabwe, which had only gained its independence in 1980, was supplying food aid to Ethiopia at the time. So there was a sense of what we call practical Pan-Africanism, if not ideologically stated.
Brilliant. Okay. Would you want to say anything about Julius Nyerere a little bit? Do you think Julius Nyerere, even though there has been talking about the idea of African socialism?
Interestingly enough, Nyerere did visit the Caribbean. He went on a tour to the Caribbean and visited Trinidad and had very interesting discussions with our Prime Minister, Dr. Eric Williams. Eric Williams is an enigma because before he became Prime Minister, he was a very vocal anti-colonialist. And in fact, it is due to a lot of his efforts that Trinidad gained its independence. Later on, having to minister to a country of so many different ethnic groups, there was less of the Pan-Africanist rhetoric coming out of our Prime Minister. He did meet Julius Nyerere. Nyerere didn't seem to speak, in what I know of Nyerere was speaking about Pan-Africanism, but about the African continent. We never got a sense when Nyerere visited the Caribbean, visited Trinidad, that he seemed to have been discussing trading, financial relationships. But as to be discussing it from a point of view of shared history, remember, East Africans have less of a direct, less of a genetic connection with the Western diaspora than, say, Central Africans from the Congo or Nigerians or Ghanaians or Senegalese. So I never got a sense that Nyerere was talking about I know he had a very the idea of Ujamaa and the idea that China, the cultural revolution in China was a model that perhaps Africa could implement where possible, was a cornerstone of his ideology. But whether I don't know, perhaps you can give me an idea as to whether Nyerere was an avowed Pan-Africanist. He may have been a regional Pan-Africanist, the East African bloc or something like that. But I don't know whether he spoke in terms like Nkrumah did of a United States of Africa.
Exactly, and that's key. The single united super-state of Africa is really the culmination of the Pan-Africanist thought. And maybe Nyerere did not speak about it, although his policies sort of paid lip service to in terms of the practical application of Ujamaa at home.